Over 1,000 years ago, here at Chaco Canyon, the American Indians built and established one of the greatest civilizations known to man. This kiva here once served as the political, social, economic, and spiritual center of the Anasazi. This great people built an expansive network of roads and interacted with more than 75 communities in this region. Over the years, Chaco emerged as the region's preeminent center of commerce. The Anasazi culture is but one of many highly intricate societies indigenous to North America. From the advanced society of the Anasazi to the mountains of Cahokia, to the democratic process of the Iroquois Confederacy, Indian nations achieved remarkable cultural success long before European contact. From the first contact, Europeans entered into treaties with Indian nations, acknowledging their sovereignty. In drafting the United States Constitution, the framers affirmed the tribe's special governmental status and set forth in Article 1, Section 8, the United States authority to regulate commerce with Indian nations, thereby firmly placing Indian tribes in our constitutional family. In 1831, Chief Justice John Marshall outlined the one basic principle of federal Indian relationship, that tribes possess a nationhood status and retain the inherent power to govern themselves. Since that time, this key principle has guided federal Indian policies. Today, tribal self-determination and self-governance reaffirm the broad powers to make and enforce laws, to tax, to establish membership, to license and regulate activities, and the authority to manage their internal affairs and tribal resources. The federal Indian relationship originated in the early interactions between the American Indians and the United States. It is manifested in the treaties, agreements, court decisions, statutes, and executive orders. These executive, legislative, and judicial actions charge the United States government with the legal and moral obligations of the highest responsibility and trust towards Indian tribes. As a result, the United States has a fiduciary responsibility to protect tribal lands, assets, resources, treaty rights, as well as the general obligation to fulfill mandates of federal laws with respect to American Indians and Alaska Natives. In 1994, President Clinton further emphasized the sovereign powers of tribal governments by issuing an executive memorandum requiring every federal agency to consult and work with tribes on a government-to-government basis. In those periods of U.S. history when the federal policy deviated from these important principles, Indian people suffered. This video focuses on the specific circumstances of 4 tribes: the Menominee, White Mountain Apache, Quinault, and the Osage. Their stories demonstrate the importance of tribal sovereignty to the well-being of the community. It also illustrates how the government-to-government relationship operates to ensure the fulfillment of the federal Indian trust responsibility in a way that respects, honors, the inherent governmental authority of tribal governments. The history of the Menominee tribe constitutes perhaps the most dramatic example of the importance of the governmental status of tribes to a social and economic well-being of tribal communities. In 1954, Congress enacted legislation to assimilate tribal peoples. In doing so, the governmental and political status of the Menominee tribe was terminated. With the stroke of a pen, the Menominee Reservation ceased to exist, and in its place was created Menominee County. The tribal commercial lumber business, their primary source of income for over 100 years, was privatized. The tribal economy became unstable and deteriorated. Thousands of acres of ancestral lands were lost. In a few short years, the Menominee plunged from prosperity to poverty. The tribal community and its people suffered greatly.
The effects of termination were major. Our tribal rolls were closed, our land became subject to taxation, a corporation structure was imposed on our tribe, and the services changed.
Tribal leaders worked for many years to restore the tribe's governmental status. Through their hard work, President Nixon in 1973 acknowledged the terrible social and economic injustice wrought by termination policy. He restored the federal recognition in the tribe's governmental and political status, and then he placed the remaining tribal assets and land into trust.
Even today, we're still recovering from the damages of termination. A great wound was stabbed in the heart of the tribe, and it takes time for individuals as well as a group to recover from such an assault on the tribal sovereignty, the tribal resources, the tribal community.
Today, the Menominee tribe has a stable and productive economy. The tribe's timber and forest products industry are prospering. The cultural values held the people and the community together during the termination era. These ties were and are the tribe's strength and most valuable resource for the future. The Menominee struggle represents the need for strong tribal governments and stable, diversified economies in tribal communities. Enactment of the Indian Self-Determination Act and Indian Education Assistance Act of 1975 marked the formal end to the termination policies of the 1950s and 60s. It ushered in a new era in the federal-Indian relationship and reversed the detrimental policies of termination period. In 1994, Congress passed the Self-Determination Amendments and the Tribal Self-Governance Act. These acts provide tribes with even greater flexibility in the management of tribal programs, resources, and services. As a result, tribal governments are now better equipped and have even greater control over programs for tribal communities. Tribes such as Quinault are using the tools provided by Tribal Self-Governance Act to assume direct management of tribal resources.
We've always been a self-regulatory tribe. We've always managed our resources from time immemorial. So when we went into self-governance in the fisheries area, that just basically provided us the opportunity to prioritize more important programs within the fisheries area.
For decades, Washington State attempted to regulate the Quinault tribal fishery by imposing laws and regulations that failed to respect tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. In 1970, on behalf of the Quinault and 6 other tribes, the United States as trustee filed a lawsuit in federal district court against the state of Washington. This action eventually confirmed the tribe's rights to co-manage the Pacific Northwest fishery.
What happened with self-governance, fisheries became more of a priority, I should say, because all natural resources are a priority, but fisheries became more of a priority, and so we were able to set aside funds in that area to improve upon the program, the equipment, things that were critical to make the program more effective and basically bring more fish back to the reservation.
Today, the Quinault tribe, along with other Pacific Northwest tribes, manage a comprehensive fishery program. The tribes regulate and enforce fishing on tribal lands and work cooperatively with the state and federal agencies to protect the fishery. Each year, tribal hatcheries rear and release over 50 million young salmon and steelhead. The tribes also participate and perform important scientific research to protect and maintain a viable fishery. Much of this scientific research focuses on reversing the long-term trend of declining fish stocks. Issues of habitat and environmental degradation, water diversions, increased foreign fishing pressure, genetic complexity, and disease are being addressed. Through self-governance, the Pacific Northwest tribes are able to work more effectively with state and federal agencies to increase the viability and sustainability of this critically important resource. As a result, the Quinault Fishery Program is a major contributor to the economy in the Pacific Northwest. The United States instituted a series of activities throughout the federal government to fulfill its commitments to tribes. It begins with better coordination and communication, increasing intergovernmental cooperation, and improving working relationships with tribal governments. The White Mountain Apache Indian Reservation is home to a rich and diverse ecosystem. The tribe has always conserved and protected their natural resources. The reservation supports large populations of native species that are depleted in other locations.
The Apache trout has always been here. It was never taken away, it has always been here. That was one of the prime examples of our taking care of our resources, our natural resources here on the reservation. How can it be that this fish had never disappeared? You know, it always existed. So it was never brought back. It has always been with us here. That was the prime example of some of the agreements that we have come about with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. How well we protect the species that are considered as endangered elsewhere. They're well and alive here. There's a kind of a coexistence with our culture, traditional values that we use in reference to development of our resources here on the reservation.
Today, the tribe and the Fish and Wildlife Service are taking an ecosystem management approach for the protection, conservation, and enhancement of the fish and wildlife resources. This management approach integrates the cultural and traditional values of the tribe. Under the Indian Self-Determination Act, tribes can enter into contracts, cooperative agreements, or receive grants for the administration of conservation programs such as hatcheries, habitat restoration, to address the daily concerns in the management of fish and wildlife resources. The goal of long-term conservation of fish and wildlife resources are achieved through effective partnerships, the sharing of technical information, and the respect for tribal cultural and traditional values. In 1831, Chief Justice John Marshall first discussed the federal trust relationship, and over the years, courts have confirmed the undisputed existence of a general trust relationship between the United States and American Indian tribes. The Federal Indian Trust Responsibility is one of the most important principles in the federal Indian law and governs the dealings between the United States government and tribal governments. Under this principle, the United States government is obligated to protect Indian trust resources and tribal treaty rights. Over 1.5 million acres of rolling hills and prairie lands of the Osage Reservation once supported large buffalo herds. What was once the subsistence lifestyle of the Osage Nation is today replaced by oil and gas development. These actively producing wells sustain the tribal economy. The federal government has an obligation to ensure that Indian mineral rights are protected. In the management of oil and gas resources, tribal and individual concerns have to be considered. Through the 1980s, the Osage Nation and other oil and gas producing tribes were concerned about the federal government's management of oil and gas resources and the timely distribution of royalty checks. Congressional hearings were held to investigate the many issues associated with the existing oil and gas and royalty management programs. To resolve these issues, the Department of Interior, in consultation with tribes, instituted special initiatives and made major changes to the existing programs. A mineral steering committee was formed to improve the delivery of services to Indian tribes and allotees by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, and Minerals Management Service. The Bureau of Indian Affairs Division of Energy and Mineral Resources developed an advanced computer system to process complex oil and gas information in a timely and accurate manner.
The idea was then to come up with these graphic user interfaces, this Windows-type use of the mouse to bring information up, to tie this all together via the internet, to allow us to service the program, to keep in touch with tribes, to furnish updates by means of wire rather than have to make visits. Obviously, we don't have much in the way of travel money, and some of the places we're working at are pretty isolated. They can't call on local training resources very easily. So the whole thing kind of comes together in using not only what is new and what is current in terms of commercial software and systems, but making use of the now infamous or famous cyberspace idea, trying to use the internet to bring it all together. And we think that this is where it belongs, that this whole idea is finally come of age, and it would be entirely fitting and appropriate for the tribes to be able to profit by that.
The National Indian Oil and Gas Evaluation Management System, known as NIOGEMS, enables tribes to retrieve, analyze, and manage its own oil and gas resources, as well as production and financial data. Now the tribe has the ability to display production data on any well within the reservation. Information which once took 3 months to process is now available in minutes. Tribal managers can now interpret geological and geophysical information to analyze oil and gas trends and to locate new oil and gas fields. Evaluation of oil and gas production provides an accurate accounting of royalty payments and identifies delinquent accounts. Tribes are using innovation, creativity, and technological advancement to build a stronger foundation for the future. Tribes are also taking bold new steps toward a new era of a federal-Indian relationship, one of cooperation, understanding, and respect. Long-standing issues are being resolved through open and candid discussions. Tribes and federal agencies are actually entering into partnerships, and significant strides are being made to strengthen tribal governments. Efforts are focused on creating economic development initiatives to subsidize social programs. Today, federal agencies are renewing the United States commitment to protect Indian rights and resources. More and more federal agencies are implementing procedures to carry out the trust responsibility. Barriers working with tribes on government-to-government basis are being removed. Federal and tribal consultation has become a standard practice. Through these efforts, every federal agency is striving to build a better, long-lasting partnership with tribal governments.